I'm here, I think, in the capacity, I didn't have that read out at the beginning, in the capacity of being Secretary of ROSE, the Radical Options for Scotland and Europe, and I think I'll say a bit about that because it is a campaigning body and a campaigning body that we need. It was established last year and it was to campaign for a European settlement that served the needs of trade unions and working people, a progressive settlement that would enable a redevelopment of the public sector, of collective bargaining, workers' rights, and the implementation of a programme for industrial and economic development. And we know full well that that's not going to be the kind of programme that the Conservatives are going to allow us to have. They are the ones that are negotiating at the moment, and we can be quite sure that whatever they put together, it will be a neoliberal type of settlement. We'll provide new freedoms, but mainly the freedoms will be for the City of London, won't be for us. So we need a campaigning body that can put the alternative, and that is what ROSE is in Scotland. It's a cross-party body. Its presidents are Jane Smith, Jim Sillars, I think it's Phil McGarry is one of them, and I think it is, yeah.
Another unpaid appointment.
And also Alex Smith, the previous MEP for the south of Scotland. It's got affiliations from, I think, most trades union councils, including Glasgow, and a number of, I think, virtually all of them, not absolutely all of them, but most of them, and quite a number of trade unions. I think probably Unison is included, but certainly Unite and RMT and one or two others here. So it is trade union backed and cross-party. So it is a body that can campaign on behalf of working people, and it's very important that it does. In terms of our position at the moment, broadly speaking, and in a non-partisan way, we back the current position of the Labour Party, which is, as has been very well expressed, for a customs union, not for the customs union or the single market. Because both, as David said, the single market or the customs union would be seriously prejudicial to any progressive settlement that would enable a Labour government or any other government of the left to develop and redevelop the economy and social provision in the interests of working people. It might be useful just to go through the definition of what the single market is. I thought Dave would have done that in his usual definitive legal way, but the single market includes, in a sense, all the EU countries, but also it includes Norway and a number of other small countries. Switzerland is tantamount to being a member of the single market, but not actually in a legal sense. There's a number of separate treaties that pull it together. So if you're in the single market, you have to obey a large section of the EU's legal apparatus. You've got to accept the free movement of capital, people, commodities and services. And that includes the right of establishment, which is the right of any company within the EU to establish in another country on its own terms, effectively, as defined legally by the European Court of Justice. You have to accept the EU rules on competition. You have to accept the EU rules on public procurement and public contracts. These are very far-reaching, and Dave's already referred to them. You've got to be compliant with all aspects of EU law through the European Court of Justice. Important to say, the European Court of Justice is not the same as the European Court of Human Rights. That's a quite separate body. It's a very important body, and it does sustain a number of crucial aspects of law that are adhered to in this country, including a large number of those concerning equalities. It precludes state aid, and it ensures that you have to adopt the EU directives on rails, energy, communications and posts. There's a number of things it doesn't require. It doesn't require compliance with EU taxation, and particularly VAT. It doesn't cover agriculture and fisheries, and it doesn't cover direct budgetary supervision. which is perhaps indirectly, if you go onto the website, the EU website about reform programs, you will find one for Norway, I think, but it is not legally enforceable. So that is the single market. And then you've got, in addition to that, the customs union. And the customs union means that you can't negotiate any deal of your own, but must adhere to all those negotiated by the EU, which includes now CETA, and it would have included TTIP if it hadn't been stopped. And some of those treaties, as Dave said, do include provisions which are about deregulation. They are about the rights of firms. They do give corporations the right in legal courts that are quite separate from the courts of any country or the European Court of Justice itself, to be able to sue governments that infringe their rights to make a profit. And if, say, an area is nationalised, they can sue the government for doing so, if they were previously wanting to or intending to or thinking they could make a profit in that area. And it is very far-reaching. Norway is a member, as I said, and it saw 2 years ago a legal case being taken against the Norwegian High Court. The Norwegian High Court had defended the rights of dockers to sustain the dock regulation system. They'd undertaken a strike or a boycott of a Danish shipping line that had attempted to unload on the docks with its own workers, which were obviously paid more cheaply than those in Norway, and had therefore infringed the dock registration scheme. They were taken to court. The Norwegian courts upheld the rights of the statutory dock labour scheme in Norway. They were struck down by the EFTA court operating EU law. So the Norwegian dock regulation scheme is now at an end. And that's all about casualisation. If you think what docks were like 50 years, 60 years, 70 years ago, I suppose, deregulated, that's what they will become in Norway as a result. So, very far-reaching. So, what is called for by Rose, and also by the Labour Party currently, is a customs union, which, as David has said, should be negotiated to have a special agreement with the European Union, one that doesn't imply the customs union or the single market. But although the Tories may be trying to negotiate their own, not one that is on the Tory terms, because we know exactly what the Tories are going to do. They will want to incorporate all the neoliberal aspects to get conformity, to be able to make a bargain. They will do so in order to protect the privileges of the City of London. That's their key objective. So they will have all the worst aspects of what is there in EU law continued, and they're already actually been transferred into British law with the right to repeal them at a subsequent stage. But if the Tories get their way, those aspects won't be repealed. The customs union that the Labour Party, I think, will try and negotiate would be one that would maintain all the environmental, production and health standards for commodities and services, for workers' rights, and probably also a number of those which regulate the City of London, because I don't think probably the Labour Party will be particularly keen to free the city traders to make dodgy deals of the kind that they were able to make up to 2008 and still want to make. It would also emphasise research and cooperation on educational transfers and exchange being maintained. So all of those things, I think, would be involved in a customs union, but not the ban on public ownership, the ban on state aid, the limits on public procurement, and all the other aspects that would impose neoliberal conditions on Britain. It's worth saying a little bit, and I don't want to go
You're fine.
find at the moment. But it's important to know the arguments about what it is that a left-wing agenda on public ownership is about. It's important to know what we're fighting for on this, because there was a document produced about 2 months ago, I think, by a consortium headed by Lord Monks, which argued, well, as Dave said, you've got lots of state-owned companies in Europe that run transport and do other things, and you've got them in this country running transport and other things here. So there's no real objection to public ownership in the EU. Now, if you believe that, you just need to go to France at the moment. The French rail workers are fighting to try and stop the imposition of the fourth railway package. They've already seen quite a lot of privatisation. The freight services were privatised in 2006. After a long fight by the French rail workers, they were defeated. But the bulk of the French rail system does remain in the control of the French state-owned rail company. That's going to have its ownership type changed, as a technicality, but the main things that they're going after in terms of the French government are to destroy the terms and conditions of the French rail workers in terms of pensions and contract security, in terms of wages. That's what they're going after, that's what the workers are fighting about, as well as also cutting out services. And why are they doing that? They're doing it to make the state-owned company, as it will become with a single state shareholder, competitive, because it's going to have to compete with private companies. And that's exactly what we've seen here. That's why conditions have been forced down and down and down. And that is the major argument why, if you want public ownership, we want public ownership that is comprehensive, that enables investment in infrastructure, investment in the system, training, continuity of employment, the kind of ownership that can provide a system, whether it's in rails or whether it's in energy, that will sustain infrastructure into the future and enable it to be provided at the cheapest possible but most efficient rate. Competition, as we've seen on the railways in this country, is absolutely disastrous. We have had the most expensive fares and the worst service. And I think I had some experience of that today when a train, I don't know who was running that train, was it a Bellio or was it?
A Bellio.
Well, they just decided, probably got a, well, yes. It's not running at a profit, this train, we're going to cancel it. Enough people on it, we'll just cancel it. And she was dumped off at Perth.
Yeah. Nowhere.
So that's the kind of train services we've got. And it's very important to remember that this is what public ownership should be about. That was the perspective of public ownership when it was established in the 1940s. It was that it should be a public service. It should not be competitive. And the same goes for public procurement. Dave knows far more about this than I do because he's managed to wheedle a few ways out of some of these things. But nonetheless, by and large, it can't be done, not well or easily. You have to put contracts out to procurement. I just kind of looking at the case of the workers in the yards in Clyde, Govan and Scotsman at the moment, very worried about future of employment because one of the big contracts has been put out to international tender. That's the Navy support and supply ships, massive big ships, which would have supplied work going on into the 1930s. How was it justified by the government? They said, it's not a warship, and because it's not a warship and it's not covered by the special conditions, it's going to have to be put out to international tender, probably go to Korea, under EU rules. Yes. Everything has to go out to international tender if it's not in very special categories. So we're seeing workers on the Clyde potentially being laid off, not immediately, but over the next 10 or 15 years' time, because these big orders have gone to an international tender. And we then perhaps turn to why we need the kind of industrial strategy of redevelopment that the Labour Party is putting forward. And as I say, Rose is not a partisan organisation, but nonetheless that programme I think is very important for Scotland. It is about redeveloping industry and the economy in a comprehensive way, using state aid, using public procurement, using public ownership, to redevelop regional economies in a country whose economy at the moment is very fragile, is declining. Key areas that it's depended on actually have been, or if we lost electronics and a lot of other things 20 years ago, has been on oil and financial services. And neither of them are likely to be very robust over the next 10 or 20 years. And everything else is very, very weak international terms, in terms of productivity. The only way of redeveloping regional economies is being able to use public procurement to be able, and local government, direct works departments, to be able to purchase goods locally, all of things which are banned under the EU. All of these things, together with state ownership, together with state aid, together with an investment bank that can take shareholdings in key companies, that is the only way forward. And for Scotland, therefore, the kind of things that are being advocated in the Labour Party's programme at the moment are very important. I think in some ways they would be advocated by some of those in the SNP. We had Alex Neil at our AGM saying, in his experience, all attempts to circumvent public procurement that he'd come across while he was minister had not been successful. And he, as somebody who is on the left of the SNP, would see the kind of constraints that are going to be, or would be imposed by the EU as prohibitive to any real Scottish sovereignty and ability from an SNP point of view to redevelop the Scottish economy. So on a bipartisan basis, the kind of things that are being called for by a customs union, not single market membership, or the customs union, are vitally important for the future. And these are the kind of things that we need a campaigning organisation for. Rose is that organisation, and I would appeal for people to become members of that, to affiliate trade union councils or trade union branches to it, so it can become a campaigning body that actually changes things over the next 9 to 10 months, or probably a longer period, as Dave said, that these negotiations will continue. I think I'll wrap up now. There are other things I could have said about the EU as an organisation that is socially, I think, very reactionary and very dangerous in terms of the way in which it impacts on ordinary people, the insecurities it creates, and therefore the breeding ground it provides for the far right, which we've seen occurring. But I think those are things that may be brought up by other people and which we could discuss in the discussion.